Good morning. The title of the sermon is Personal Resurrection. There are two scriptures, both that revolve around Peter. The first is the story that is found in all four Gospels of Peter denying Jesus. From Luke 22, then they seized Jesus and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down, Peter sat down among them. And then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, "This man also was with him." But Peter denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You were also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of an hour, still another insisted, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he too was a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. The second scripture is the very last story from the Gospel of John, the 21st chapter, which takes place on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Peter said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Jesus said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." Then Jesus said to Peter a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved deeply because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I do love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Truly I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you to where you do not want to go." This Jesus said to indicate the kind of death Peter was to glorify God. And after saying this, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." Thus ends the reading of the word. It had once been a thriving movement, drawing thousands of people who witnessed things that were so clearly of God that there was no denying it. But as the leader began to talk about suffering and rejection and death, the movement began to fade. The crowds grew smaller and smaller until all that was left was a very small group, the leader's inner circle of core disciples. And eventually they abandoned the movement as well. It was over, dead, and in a tomb. Movements almost always have but one life. It is painful to watch them die, and when the followers of this would-be Galilean Messiah called it quits, clearly this movement was dead. Yet less than 3 months after what should have been its final breath, this little movement was not dead. In fact, it grew and it grew, drawing in hundreds and hundreds of people who even made great sacrifices to be part of it. Within 3 years, it had grown to where it was now the second largest religious movement in the area. Over the next 30 years, it would spread to nearly every city in the Roman world, and the movement has continued to grow decade after decade, century after century. Today, it consists of nearly 1/3 of the 7.8 billion people on this planet. It continues to spread, spreading fastest in the poorest countries of the world, more slowly where people are distracted by great wealth, and it includes us. We are 2 weeks into the season of Easter. Easter Sunday, also called Resurrection Day, is without a doubt the turning point of this movement, which we call Christianity, but Jesus referred to simply as the way, the truth, the life. And as important as Jesus' resurrection was to the movement, the reason people are drawn in increasing numbers is because it is a movement not only based on Jesus' resurrection, but equally based on our own personal resurrections. Christianity is a personal resurrection faith. And if there is no personal resurrection, then our faith will often become little more than a thin veneer that is shining on the outside, but with little life and power within. When it came to Jesus' crucifixion, Peter really never had a chance. Oh, yes, he talked a good game about never abandoning Jesus, even if he would die. Yet as Jesus' own death became likely, Peter's faith collapsed. Suddenly, Peter's brave words to Jesus, "I will never abandon you, even if I must die," became empty words. So Peter did what most of us would do when his life was on the line. He denied Jesus, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then the cock crowed, as Jesus said it would, and Peter wept bitterly. The 21st chapter of John that tells of Jesus' final conversation with Peter takes place after the resurrection. And while Jesus' resurrection changes much, there is an important part of Peter that remains very unresurrected, which the scriptures make abundantly clear. Jesus may have risen, but Peter was still stuck in a tomb of sorts, and worse yet, he wanted it to remain closed and hidden. The 21st chapter of John's gospel, this resurrection story, is also a resurrection story for Peter as well as Jesus. Now, Peter, like the other disciples, had experienced the transforming power of Jesus' resurrection, and with that resurrection came the absolute conviction that God was real, that good triumphed over evil, and perhaps most significantly, that death was not the end of life. It is hard to overestimate the significance of Jesus rising from death to life. However, while Peter showed a confidence on the outside, on the inside, Peter was living the life of a fugitive, running from a past that he was hoping was deeply buried, never to see the light of day again. It is to an outwardly confident Peter that Jesus pulls aside after breakfast on the beach on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus essentially asks Peter the same question 3 times. The first time Jesus asked the question, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter responded undoubtedly with great exuberance, "Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Good, Peter, I want you to feed my sheep." But when Jesus asked Peter the same question a second time, you know how it is when someone asks you a question and you answer the question, and then they ask you the same question a second time. Obviously, there's something wrong with your answer. And so Peter responded confused that second time, "Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Good, Peter, I want you to take care of my flock." But when Jesus asked Peter a third time, "Peter, do you love me?" Suddenly that confusion was replaced with this clarity. As Jesus was taking Peter back before the resurrection, before the crucifixion, to that evening before, when in his fear for his own life, he denied Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then as Jesus said, the cock crowed, and Peter wept bitterly. It was the worst moment of his entire life. Carolyn was an old friend of Sonia's. They met when the 2 of them worked at a home for profoundly disabled children. Carolyn worked there as a cook. She was warm and friendly, very down to earth. Sonia became good friends not only with Carolyn, but also with her husband, Daniel. Carolyn and Daniel both had gone through dismal first marriages. Yet about 2 years before Sonia and I were married, they had found each other, were married, and began building a life together. They purchased some property east of Carson City and placed a small modular home on it. Daniel, who worked in maintenance at the prison in Carson City, could build anything. He added on an addition to the house, built a shed, and put in a beautiful garden. Carolyn loved to sew, and she made most of their clothing as well as curtains and pillows that adorned their home. They both loved animals and had a zoo of dogs and cats and birds. Over a number of years, they slowly made the house into a wonderful and beautiful home. About the time Sonia and I were married, in 1984, Carolyn began worshiping at a small church about 2 miles from their home. It was a warm and friendly community of faith. She began to get involved with a Bible study group. She called one day to say that she had given her life to Christ. She was excited about her growing faith. Then tragedy struck. Daniel was diagnosed with a brain tumor. It was growing rapidly, and surgery was described as the only medical option. They gave Daniel about a 50-50 chance of survival, but that was if the tumor was benign. If malignant, the chances of survival went down drastically. The operation lasted 12 hours. The tumor was malignant. Daniel survived the surgery miraculously well, but that was only the first step. For the next 6 months, he needed chemotherapy. During the chemo, he lost 80 pounds and looked skeletal. Carolyn's church community was there for her. The church lifted up Daniel each and every Sunday in prayer. They brought by food. Miraculously, Daniel pulled through. In a way, it was as if Carolyn had gone through the tomb and found resurrection on the other side. Her faith blossomed. Her involvement in the church grew. Life was exciting. She took on a job as an aerobics instructor and was feeling better about herself than she had ever felt in her entire life. For a long time, Carolyn and Daniel had wanted children but were unable to conceive. They had just begun the long adoption process when Daniel's tumor was discovered. Yet a year after Daniel's surgery, they restarted the adoption process anew. And then one day, in the spring of 1990, they were told that a child was imminent. With that news, Daniel expected Carolyn to be ecstatic. But instead, she wasn't. She became deeply melancholy. Daniel didn't know what it was. Carolyn wouldn't talk about it. On a dark Saturday morning, a couple of weeks after Easter, Daniel called. Carolyn had disappeared. She just disappeared. Then a workmate of Carolyn's called. She told Daniel that there was a male student in one of her classes, in one of the aerobics classes that Carolyn taught. This workmate feared that Carolyn had taken off with that student. A few days later, Daniel called us. His worst nightmare had become a reality. Carolyn contacted him and in a stone-cold voice said that she wanted an immediate divorce. She kept saying over and over again that she was tired of living a lie. She said that nobody knew her. They only thought they knew her. She said, "I'm tired of being judged for my past." Daniel said to her, "What past? I don't know what you're talking about." Carolyn just kept repeating, "Everyone secretly judges me. Everyone secretly judges me because of my past, but no longer. I'm breaking free entirely from the past. I'm a new person. Goodbye." Click. That was the last time we heard from Carolyn. Daniel nor anyone else, as far as Sonia and I were aware, ever figured out what it was in Carolyn's past that she was running from. What it was in her past that she secretly felt she was being judged for. Perhaps it had something to do with becoming a mother. Perhaps she felt that she was undeserving of the sort of goodness in life that was unfolding for her and Daniel. All we know is that it was something that caused her to feel that she had to run away, to live like a fugitive. There was tremendous power in the resurrection of Jesus. Yet as the story of Peter communicates, resurrection is not limited only to Jesus rising from the tomb. It includes those who follow him rising from their own personal tombs to find their own personal resurrections. And this is the way the Gospel of John ends, the final story, with Peter being raised to a new life, a life that was not only about him forever living as a fugitive, running from the past, but finding something very different. For when Jesus asked Peter a third time, "Peter, do you love me?" As Peter realizes that Jesus knows his darkest shame, knows his denial, knows his betrayal, Peter responds by opening himself up, which is seen in his words to Jesus, "Lord, you know everything. Lord, you know everything. And still, I can say to you, yes, Lord, I love you." And then Jesus affirms Peter with one of the highest affirmations you find in the gospel. He says, "Now, Peter, you are whole. Now you are truly resurrected to a new life. For there will come a time when you will once again be asked to deny me, even though it will cost you your life. But you will be faithful even to the end." Our personal resurrections take place and continue to take place when we are willing to do what Peter does, to stop being fugitives, to stop running, to stop hiding. when we come to truly realize that the power of God which raised Jesus from death to life can forgive and heal anything that we feel we must hide and run away from. In the season of the coronavirus, a tomb of sorts, may we not only embrace the resurrection of Jesus in this season of Easter, may we also embrace the grace-filled power of God to raise us to a new life, our own personal resurrection. Amen.